At 20 hours on the morning of August 17, 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert Mitchell pulled his damaged P-47 Thunderbolt into a steep climb over the Belgian countryside, trailing black smoke from his starboard engine. He had been hit by flak during a strafing run on a German supply convoy near Liège. The engine was dead. The controls were sluggish. He had maybe 3 minutes before the aircraft stopped flying altogether. Mitchell was 23 years old, from Kansas. He had been in Europe for 6 weeks. This was his 9th mission. He looked down through the broken canopy at the patchwork of dark fields below. No lights, no roads he could see, just farmland stretching in every direction under a moonless sky. The Thunderbolt shuddered. The good engine coughed. Mitchell made his decision. He was going down. The only question was whether he died in the crash or survived long enough for the Germans to find him. He aimed for what looked like an open field and cut the remaining engine. The Thunderbolt dropped like a stone. No power, no control, just gravity and momentum. Mitchell braced himself against the stick. The field rushed up. The aircraft hit hard. The landing gear collapsed. The fuselage plowed through dirt and crops for 200 yards before slamming into a drainage ditch and stopping. Mitchell tasted blood. His head had hit something during the impact. His left shoulder felt wrong, but he was alive. He could move. He had to move. Every German unit within 10 miles would have heard the crash. He unbuckled and climbed out of the cockpit. His boots hit soft earth. He could smell aviation fuel leaking from ruptured tanks. He needed to get away from the aircraft before it exploded or before someone came to investigate. Mitchell stumbled across the field in the darkness. His shoulder screamed with every step. After 50 yards, he collapsed behind a hedgerow. He could see the dark shape of his Thunderbolt behind him. No fire yet. Maybe the fuel tanks were too damaged to ignite. Maybe he had gotten lucky. He lay in the dirt, catching his breath. His flying suit was torn. His hands were bleeding. He had a survival kit with a compass, maps, water purification tablets, and a .45 caliber pistol with 2 magazines. Standard equipment for downed pilots. The maps showed escape routes to Spain through France, 700 miles on foot through occupied territory. Mitchell had been briefed. He knew the protocol: evade capture, find the resistance, get to the Pyrenees. But right now, he could barely stand. He must have passed out. When he opened his eyes, the sky was getting lighter. Dawn. He could see the crashed Thunderbolt clearly now, sitting in a wheat field with one wing crumpled and the tail section bent at an angle. And he could see a man walking toward the aircraft. Mitchell froze. The man was old, maybe 60, wearing dark work clothes and boots, carrying what looked like a farming tool. Mitchell's hand moved to the pistol on his belt. If the man was going to turn him in, Mitchell would have to run or shoot. He didn't want to shoot a civilian. The old man reached the Thunderbolt. He walked around it slowly, examining the damage. Then he turned and looked directly at the hedgerow where Mitchell was hiding. The man said something in a language Mitchell didn't understand, French or Flemish. Then he made a gesture. "Come here." Mitchell didn't move. The old man repeated the gesture, more urgently. He looked around at the surrounding fields, then back at Mitchell. "Come here, now." Mitchell stood up. His shoulder sent lightning through his chest. He walked toward the old man, keeping his hand near the pistol. When he got close, the old man spoke again. This time Mitchell caught one word he recognized. Allemand. German? The old man was asking if he was German. Mitchell shook his head. American, United States. The old man's expression changed. He nodded. He pointed at the Thunderbolt, then at himself, then at Mitchell. Then he made a covering gesture with his hands. Hide. Mitchell understood. The old man was offering to hide him. The farmer's name was Henri Dubois. He was 61 years old. He owned a small farm 3 kilometers outside the village of Belgium. He had lived on that farm his entire life. His wife had died in 1938. His 2 sons were gone. One killed in 1940 during the German invasion, the other taken for forced labor in Germany in 1942. Henri lived alone with his dairy cows, his chickens, and his memories, and now an American pilot. Henri led Mitchell to a barn behind the farmhouse. The barn was old, built of stone and timber, with a steep tile roof and a hayloft. The ground floor housed 6 dairy cows in wooden stalls. The upper floor was storage, hay bales, old equipment, tools. Henri pointed to a corner of the hayloft. He moved several bales aside, revealing a space behind them, large enough for a man to hide. He gestured for Mitchell to climb up. Mitchell climbed the ladder to the loft. The pain in his shoulder made every rung an ordeal. When he reached the top, Henri followed. The old farmer arranged the hay bales to create a hidden alcove, then gestured for Mitchell to get inside. Mitchell squeezed into the space. It was dark. It smelled like dry grass and dust. Henri placed the last bale in position, sealing Mitchell inside except for a small gap for air. Through the gap, Mitchell could see Henri's face. The old man held up one finger. Wait. Then he climbed back down the ladder. Mitchell waited in the darkness. He could hear the cows moving in their stalls below. His shoulder throbbed. His head ached. He realized he had no idea if he could trust this man. Henri could be walking to the village right now to report an American pilot. German soldiers could be surrounding the barn at this very moment, but Mitchell was too tired and hurt to run. So he waited. An hour later, Henri returned. He brought water in a clay jug, bread and cheese. He helped Mitchell drink. The water was cold and tasted like minerals. The bread was dense and dark. Mitchell ate like he hadn't eaten in days. Henri spoke in French, then seemed to realize Mitchell couldn't understand. He switched to broken English. Very broken? But Mitchell got the essential message. German soldiers were searching the area. They had found the Thunderbolt. They were going farm to farm, looking for the pilot. Henri had told them he saw nothing. They had searched his barn, but not carefully. They were moving on to the next farm. Mitchell would need to stay hidden, maybe for days, maybe longer. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Henri Dubois had hidden downed Allied airmen before. Mitchell was the 7th. The first had been a British Wellington bomber crew in 1941. 3 men who had bailed out over Henri's fields after a night raid on Cologne. Henri had kept them in the barn for 2 weeks before passing them to a resistance network that moved them toward France. The second was a Canadian pilot in early 1942. A Hurricane fighter shot down during a patrol. Henri had hidden him for a month. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th were American B-17 crew members from different aircraft shot down in late 1942. Henri had sheltered them for periods ranging from 3 days to 6 weeks, depending on when the resistance could move them. The 6th was a British Spitfire pilot named James Crawford. Crawford had been shot down in June 1943. He had been in Henri's barn for 2 months when Mitchell arrived. Now there were 2. The barn became a secret world. Henri had constructed a false wall in the hayloft, creating a hidden room approximately 12 feet by 8 feet. The entrance was concealed behind hay bales. Inside, there were straw mattresses, blankets, a bucket for waste, and a few books in English that Henri had collected from the previous pilots. Crawford was 26 years old, from London. He had been flying Spitfires for 2 years. He had 5 confirmed kills. He was supposed to have been evacuated by the resistance in July, but the local network had been compromised. 2 resistance members had been arrested by the Gestapo. The escape line had shut down. Crawford was stuck. Now Mitchell was stuck with him. The 2 pilots lived in the hidden room above Henri's dairy cows. Every morning at 500, Henri would climb the ladder and bring them water, bread, and whatever food he could spare. Milk from the cows, eggs from the chickens, sometimes cheese, rarely meat. Henri himself barely had enough to eat under German rationing, but he shared what he had. The pilots couldn't move during the day. German patrols were irregular, but frequent. The barn was visible from the road. Any noise could attract attention. So Crawford and Mitchell sat in the darkness and waited. They spoke in whispers. They played chess with pieces carved from wood scraps. They read the same 3 books over and over. At night, they could move around more freely. Henri would let them climb down from the loft and walk in the barn, stretch their legs, breathe air that didn't smell like hay and cow manure. Sometimes Henri would let them step outside into the farmyard for 10 minutes, always after midnight, always in total darkness. Mitchell's shoulder healed slowly. Crawford helped him fashion a sling from torn cloth. The pain faded over weeks. The mobility returned. By October, Mitchell could move his arm almost normally. Winter came, the temperature dropped. The hidden room had no heat. Henri brought extra blankets. The pilots wore every piece of clothing they had. At night, they could see their breath in the darkness. Crawford developed a cough that lasted for weeks. Mitchell worried it was pneumonia, but Crawford survived. In December 1943, Henri hid 2 more pilots. A B-24 Liberator had been shot down near Brussels. 2 crew members had bailed out and made their way to Huy. Someone in the village knew about Henri. The 2 Americans arrived at the farm after dark, led by a teenage boy Henri had never seen before. Now there were 4 men in the hidden room. The space became impossibly cramped. 4 bodies, 4 sets of breathing, 4 men trying to stay silent during the day, trying not to go insane from boredom and confinement. The new arrivals were a bombardier named Stevens and a waist gunner named Coleman. Both were younger than Mitchell. Stevens was 20, Coleman was 19. Henri somehow found more food, more blankets. He rearranged the hidden room to create more space. He brought them news from a contraband radio he kept hidden in his house. The Allies were advancing in Italy. The Soviets were pushing west. The bombing campaign over Germany was intensifying. The war was being won, but for the 4 men in the barn, the war had stopped. They existed in a frozen state, not captured, not free, just waiting. In January 1944, 2 more pilots arrived. A P-38 Lightning pilot named Harper and a B-17 co-pilot named Walsh. Both shot down in separate incidents, both directed to Henri's farm by the fragmented remains of the resistance network. 6 men, 12 feet by 8 feet. Henri was 62 years old. He was hiding 6 Allied airmen in his barn. If the Germans discovered them, Henri would be executed. There was no question about it. Harboring enemy soldiers was punishable by death. The Germans had executed civilians for less, but Henri kept hiding them. He told Mitchell once, in his broken English, why he did it. His son, his eldest, killed in 1940, had been a soldier. When the Germans invaded Belgium, his son had fought. He had died near the Albert Canal, trying to stop a panzer advance. Henri had never recovered his body. Henri believed that somewhere, perhaps in Germany, perhaps in a prison camp, there might be a German father who would have hidden a Belgian soldier, who would have shown kindness to an enemy because the enemy was someone's son. Henri didn't know if such a man existed, but he acted as if he did. The 6 pilots lived through the winter of 1943-44 in Henri Dubois' barn. They played chess tournaments. They memorized poetry from the 3 books. They told stories about their lives before the war. Mitchell talked about Kansas, wheat fields that looked like the fields around the barn, except nobody was trying to kill him there. Crawford talked about London, the Blitz, watching the city burn. Stevens talked about his girl back in Ohio. He was supposed to marry her when he got home. Coleman, the youngest, talked about baseball. He had played minor league ball before enlisting. He described every game he could remember in excruciating detail. The other pilots pretended to be annoyed, but they listened. It gave them something to think about besides the war. On the night of March 18, 1944, Crawford and Walsh said goodbye to the others. They shook hands. They promised to tell the story when they got back to England. They promised the war would be over soon. They promised to come back and find Henri after it was all done. The woman led them away into the darkness. Mitchell never saw Crawford again. He learned after the war that Crawford and Walsh had made it to Spain. They had been repatriated to England in May 1944. Crawford returned to combat and was shot down again over Germany in August 1944. He was captured and spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. 4 pilots remained in Henri's barn: Mitchell, Stevens, Coleman, and Harper. In April, the resistance woman returned. She could take 2 more. Stevens and Harper drew the short straws this time. They left on April 23rd. Mitchell and Coleman were alone now, just the 2 of them in the hidden room. After months of cramped quarters with 6 men, the space felt enormous. They spread out. They could lie down without touching each other. They could breathe without smelling someone else's breath, but they missed the others. The barn felt emptier, quieter, more dangerous somehow. May came. The weather warmed. Henri's cows went out to pasture during the day. The barn was quieter without them. Mitchell and Coleman could talk more freely during the daytime. They still whispered, but they didn't have to compete with the sound of cows. They listened to Henri's contraband radio at night. The BBC broadcasts were cryptic but clear enough. Something big was coming. Troop movements, preparations, the invasion everyone had been waiting for. On June 6, 1944, Henri climbed into the loft with news. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The invasion had begun. Mitchell and Coleman sat in the darkness and tried to imagine it. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men pouring onto the beaches of France, the beginning of the end. But they were still in Belgium, still in the barn, still waiting. The resistance woman returned in July. She could take both of them. The escape line was operating at full capacity now. With the Allies in France, the Germans were distracted. The routes were opening up. Mitchell and Coleman prepared to leave. After 11 months in the barn, 11 months of hiding, waiting, existing in a 12 by 8 foot room, they were finally going home. On the night of July 14, 1944, they said goodbye to Henri Dubois. Mitchell tried to find words, tried to express what Henri had done, tried to thank the old farmer for risking his life every single day for nearly a year to keep two strangers alive. Henri just shook his hand. He said something in French that Mitchell didn't understand. Then he said in English, "Go home. Tell them." Mitchell and Coleman were led away by the resistance woman. They walked through the darkness, following her through fields and forests, moving south toward France. They crossed the border 3 days later. They reached the Pyrenees in August. They crossed into Spain on foot, climbing through mountain passes at night. They reached the British consulate in Barcelona on August 30th, 1944. They were flown to England on September the 2nd. They were debriefed by military intelligence. They were cleared to return to duty. Mitchell flew 6 more combat missions before the war ended. Coleman was reassigned to a training squadron in the United States. He never flew combat again. In October 1944, Belgium was liberated by Allied forces. Henri Dubois was still on his farm, still milking his cows, still feeding his chickens. The Germans were gone. The war was moving east. Military intelligence interviewed Henri as part of the liberation process. He told them about the pilots he had hidden, 7 in total: Crawford, Mitchell, Coleman, Stevens, Harper, Walsh, and one more who arrived after Mitchell and Coleman left, a Canadian Halifax bomber navigator named Ross who had hidden in the barn for 6 weeks before being evacuated in August. 7 Allied airmen, hidden in a barn for periods ranging from 2 weeks to 11 months. All of them survived. All of them returned home. Henri Dubois was awarded the King's Medal for Courage by the British government in 1945. He received the American Medal of Freedom in 1946. He attended neither ceremony. He was 63 years old and didn't want to travel. Robert Mitchell visited Henri in 1947. He brought his wife. They stayed at the farm for 3 days. Mitchell showed her the barn, the hidden room, the place where he had lived for 11 months. His wife cried. Mitchell cried. Henri made them dinner, bread, cheese, milk from his cows. Henri died in 1956 at the age of 73. Heart failure. He was buried next to his wife in the cemetery in Huy. 18 people attended the funeral. 4 of them were pilots Henri had hidden during the war. Mitchell was one of them. After Henri's death, his farm was sold. The barn still stands. In 1982, the Belgian government placed a plaque on the wall. In this barn, Henri Dubois sheltered Allied airmen during the occupation. His courage saved lives. His memory endures. Robert Mitchell died in 1998 at the age of 78. In his will, he left a sum of money to maintain Henri Dubois' grave in perpetuity. The headstone reads, Henri Dubois, 1883-1956, farmer, patriot, savior. Sometimes courage doesn't come from battles or medals or dramatic moments. Sometimes it comes from an old farmer who shares his bread with strangers, who risks everything for people he's never met, who builds a hidden room in a barn and keeps it secret for 3 years. 7 men came home because one man decided that kindness was worth dying for. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Henri Dubois doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.